There's so many topics. I looked at all the...
It's recording now.
Oh, perfect. Looking at all the topics for the reps, it's so exciting to look at all those different diverse topics and ideas. And I mean, I think we're all in that position where we're so interested in this area. So the more we can broaden our knowledge and our experiences, I just think it's fabulous. So yeah, well done, Rachel, setting it up. I think it's a fabulous initiative.
Oh, it's wonderful, because I think, the chance for us all to reach out to each other, and also, just find a research buddy or a research group. There's so much strength in numbers, and certainly I think in academia particularly, the idea of this sort of lone researcher is no more. We used to have a lot of, well, we still have a lot of ego-driven academics, but actually it's impossible to meet the research demands when you're consistently producing things by yourself. It just becomes debilitating. So, being able to divide and conquer and share ideas and develop publications and things together, it's really important, but it's also really important for our academic well-being too.
Well, absolutely. It's so rich just to hear different perspectives and different ideas. And I know within my staff, the conversations we have are very diverse, because my staff are relatively new, and we're having some really interesting conversations about, portfolio assessments and different ways of assessing practical PE that empower students. So that, to me, has been interesting, because a lot of people across the board are generally not exploring those sort of topics as much as I probably would like.
Yeah.
And we know that the changes in the syllabus at the moment to 7 to 10 in New South Wales, lead us to some challenging conversations. So,
for sure.
Yeah, but yeah, certainly exciting opportunities to start these conversations, which I think is great.
Absolutely, yeah. So we're just plugging reps here, because obviously this is a guest seminar.
Yes. Absolutely. And as we've got a few people coming in here, which is good.
Yeah. Okay, so I will share my screen.
All right. Would you like me to introduce you?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming along and making the time, because we know there's some challenging time zones, and we're all busy with all the bits and pieces that we're doing. My name's Simon Ward. I'm a director of Pediatric PE Sport and Outdoor Education at International Grammar School in Sydney, and it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. Rachael Jefferson Buchanan. She's a lecturer in Human Movement Studies. She's going to be presenting our lecture today, Health and PE, and Creative Arts within Charles Sturt's University School of Education on the Albury-Wodonga campus. She's a physical education and inclusion specialist, and fascinated by the body in the health and movement space. Her PhD focused on the governance of the body in physical education in England from 1902 to 2016. Rachel's a well-known inclusion activist in physical education as a teacher, as a researcher, and as an international educational consultant for the University of Cambridge, UNICEF, UNESCO, and Montrose. Her inclusion work seriously began back in the 1990s, when she experienced teenage students' low motivation rates in physical education, particularly girls and the less able. So she reinvented the curriculum in the International School of Geneva whilst teaching there, making it feminized and student-friendly. In her 20-year role in teacher education and as a researcher, Rachel continues to fight for student-centered and inclusive physical education pedagogy. Rachel enjoys social media and the wonderful connection she makes here. She's written popular gender and sport articles for The Age and The Conversation, as she believes in the power of telling stories to raise the general public's awareness of athletes' inclusions, issues, and rights. This seminar today focuses on Rachel's recent Routledge book chapter, which is part of a book that was developed by Charles Sturt University's Gender and Feminist Network, of which Rachel is an active member. It's entitled How the Gender Body is Constructed in the Neoliberal Schooling Context Through Discipline and Healthism in Contemporary Physical Education. So welcome, Rachel. Thank you so much for your time. I'll hand over to you, and we look forward to your presentation.
Oh, thank you for the lovely introduction, Simon. Thanks. It's lovely to to be here and to share my research with you. This session is being recorded as well, so there will be options for in the kind of line of inclusion that I believe in. There will be options for others to join and I will put a link onto our Facebook page. So I will put some links to our research in physical education and sport and everything at the end, so you can hook into those if you've not yet found us. We are a relatively new organization. We started up this time last year. It's already a year. So as you can see, this research focuses on a recent book chapter of mine, as Simon was saying, and this is a book that was written by a gender, feminist and network at Charles Sturt University, where I work, and it's a book that's been edited by Bridget Al. The full reference is at the end of this presentation if you want to look that one up. And the key thing that I want to emphasize is throughout this is the way that the body is gendered in the physical education space in current times. So I'm going to give you a short introduction, really, in terms of what a genealogical approach is, so that you can understand how my book chapter was developed methodologically. And I'll also consider the advantages of genealogy. I'm a bit of a promoter of genealogy because it doesn't involve ethics. It's an analysis of power discourses, and we can just use existing documents. And so there are lots of advantages to doing it, because ethics, I'm sure those of you who do research here, ethics processes can take a very long time, and they're very, dare I say, irksome at times. And so following that, I'll explore some key themes in my book chapter and how they arose, because that's the whole idea about genealogy, is that they actually arise. It's not that we're searching for particular themes or discourses. They actually come from everyday documents that we engage with. So in terms of genealogy, I always call myself a bit of a troublemaker. Certainly, if you know me on social media, I'm often sort of throwing a pebble in the pond, and lots of ripples emerge. And that's because I'm continually questioning what I do as an academic, as a researcher, as a teacher. And what I loved about genealogy when I was introduced to it by my sociology professors, who were my PhD supervisors, was that they kept saying to me, you know, what you find is what you find. And you know, while that can be a bit loose and a bit disconnected, and people who like to control things would find that very difficult, I found it really exciting, because I was actually not searching for particular things. So the idea is that there are no essences to be determined behind historical progressions. So when we look at the linear nature of physical education history, it's not chronological within the genealogical approach, and there's no teleological, i.e. there's no end purpose to a particular sequence of events. So it's about unsettling things, and if you don't like feeling uncomfortable or unsettled, then you're probably not going to like this particular methodology. But I really like it, and as I say, I'm a bit of a troublemaker, and rather than cultivating consensus, I like to actually question consensus and see what lies beneath it. And in terms of this particular methodology, it's very much connected with Nietzsche's work. He wrote a book back in 1887, and it was entitled On the Genealogy of Morality. And there's a more recent text by Foucault in 1977 called Discipline and Punish. Now, if you're a sociologist, you will know Foucault. He is quite difficult to grapple with, and not many PE people work with Foucault's work, but I think it has huge potential. Both theorists actually contest this assumption that history moves forward in this very from a particular origin. And they argue that there are absolutely, you know, there's no function, there's no end purpose or anything. So that's the exciting part, because what we can do is we can examine some of the power relations that arise, and underneath the theme that emerges, and we can also find new truths and new types of knowledges. So what we find is that Foucault, he replaces this notion of continuity and origin with two alternative concepts that he borrows from Nietzsche's work on the genealogy of morality. And he calls these emergence and descent. So emergence is about seeking to question that which exists or came into being in the first place, where you are acknowledging that something is just an episode. It's not a final series of something. So it's very episodic in nature. And then we have descent, and that involves tracing the descent of something. And you don't have to do that by going back in time in this chronological way. It could just arise from something that you're investigating and exploring. So there's this sense of randomness, this piecemeal sort of approach. And you could discover all sorts of really extreme emotions, such as passion or hatred, discrimination. All sorts of things could come through from your particular genealogical approach. And it can also expose very shameful origins of particular long-held traditions, long-held conventions that we've actually just accepted as the norm. So this is what I find really exciting. If you've been keeping up with some of my stuff on social media, I just wrote an article for the conversation on, for example, the long-held tradition of BMI as a tool. So you can just Google that one. But basically, I've questioned why we have it as a tradition and how it emerges from a mathematical model, and we should have a more holistic approach. So this is how I use genealogy to be a bit of a troublemaker. So power knowledge. If you want to have a look at some of this a little bit more deeply, then you'll need to go to Foucault's work. The reference is at the end. We have three types of, excuse me a minute, just take some water. Three types of power, according to Foucault. So I've tried to visualize those in the triangle here for you and make it a little bit more easy for you to grapple with. So sovereignty is top down, and it's what we call economic functionality. So it serves to preserve the production and perpetuate class domination through these. So sovereignty, it still works nowadays. We still have kings and queens across the world, but we don't actually need to have a king or queen to make this work, although it is attached to monarchy. Essentially, power works in this kind of macro way, in a top-down way, and there's a singular source of power. So it's about being owned as a commodity. So an institution such as a school, dare I say, or even a teacher as an agent of a particular institution such as a school, could be viewed as possessors of sovereign power. So we like to think that, you know, we're very inclusive and democratic in what we do, but we are as teachers, we are agents within these institutions with this top-down power. So secondly, we have governmentality, and that's where power operates over or through the body. And in our contemporary age, Foucault refers to this as being capillary-like. So that's something I particularly like. You know, as a PE person, we always talk about blood and systems, aren't we? So that's situated at the kind of line between the technologies of power and the technologies of self, where there is this notion of agency, but there is this notion of resistance as well. So power doesn't dominate us, so we don't have any capacity to be free. But what Foucault talks about is having regulated freedom, which is quite an interesting concept, where we feel as though we have agency, but we're still regulated by the power and the networks in which we operate. So I often refer to this, and as do other theorists, as networks of governance. And we might kind of reflect on, for example, the COVID period, where there was a network of biomedical governance, where everything was about the vaccine and everybody getting vaccinated and so on. In many different countries, we didn't have this holistic notion of what health was. So that's kind of a typical sort of contemporary view of how power operated in COVID times. And then we have discipline. And discipline is power over and through. So there is this diffusion of power through the social body. And this is more about the kind of practiced and the docile body. And you often find physical educationalists will talk about how in the first stages of physical education, particularly in my research in England, we referred to physical education as physical training. So it became PT rather than PE. And there was a lot of discipline being practiced in that time. There were children who were being made to do routines and regimes of physical movements that were supposed to be good for their posture, supposed to be good for their health, etc. So that was a time of very strong disciplinary power. And so that's about the, that sort of shows you a little bit about how you can have three different types of power, but they could also be operating all together, all at the same time as well. So this is not sort of saying that they can be isolated. It's very much about their interconnection. So Foucault's conception of genealogy is that it's a problematization. It's how and why certain things, for example, behavior or phenomena or processes, actually become a problem. So there's this, he suggests that this problematization, it invites us to reconstruct particular problems. So we need to kind of consider submerged problems. We need to consider why things are happening, how things are happening, and we need to go back to the depth of these problems and actually work out what's lodged deep inside of these problems to find out why we have certain ways of doing things in our contemporary age. So he says that in the past, things were ordered very, very differently, and that's because of power struggles between various institutions, various parties, and that their earlier practices in institutions, we might see them as potentially inevitable, but in actual fact, they're never that. They're this entwinement of power and this entwinement of truth. So power and truth continually being entwined and enmeshed and intersecting. So the idea of all of this is of problematizing the space, the physical education subject per se, is that we can actually pull it apart and begin to study different power relations that exist within society and how we have been conditioned as teachers and how we condition others as students, etc. And obviously students, for example, that I train in physical education at university level. And it's about rewriting history. So what I do and what all genealogical researchers do is we deconstruct links between the power discourses and the technologies, also known as apparatus, by Foucault, where there are these endless underpinning power struggles. And in that sense, we're not reading the documents. What we're actually doing is we're deconstructing them and we're finding things that emerge, how the knowledge was produced, what kind of truth evolved from that. And we never say there's one singular truth. We always say in sociology and in genealogy more particularly, we say there are multiple truths to things that arise. So when discussing genealogy, Foucault describes the body, which I absolutely love because, as you know, the body has been excluded from history. And so it's only in the last few decades that we've begun to see how the body is really, really important. And what Foucault says, he goes right back in the 1970s, and he says we've ignored and excluded the body from history. And he sees the body as a primary document for the genealogist. He says, and I quote, that the body is the inscribed surface of events traced by language and dissolved by ideas. And he talks about this locus of a disassociated self. And he says, in that sense, the body is emerging as really, really important, which is why I ended up taking the body as the focus of my PhD, and looked at this whole notion of the governance of the body in physical education across this lengthy time period from 1902 to 2016. So on this slide, I'm giving you a basic process that you might follow in your own research. And this is founded on my own research process. So what I did was I created a discourse map, and I found that to be a very important process. I was aware it could eventually, offer all sorts of biases and so on. But what I looked at with my selected forms of evidence was that they became my principal objects of analysis. So not talking with people, not interviews, not surveys, nothing, just the documents were enough for me to actually analyze. And I looked at hundreds of different documents. So once I'd selected this literature, which we often call grey literature, it's called grey literature because it's very unusual for researchers to use grey literature, which again means that we have an advantage of it being novel and innovative work that we do. So often everyday documents such as syllabuses, policies, etc., we just ignore them. We just see them as important for their own sake, but we don't actually interrogate them and see them as primary documents for research. So I thought this would be a great way to, because in a PhD, you have to produce new research and novel research. You can't just refer to others. So that's why I chose this particular genealogical approach. So you need to decipher these objects, your documents. You need to decipher them, and you need to have a look at their contingency. And you need to really get really deep into them and look at their complexity. So you're essentially doing what I call a micro-analysis of power relations. And it operates on the tiniest details. So it may just be that healthism arises and that you see this tiny little mentions of healthism again and again and again, gradually through the document. Or it may only come up 4 times, but it may come up 25 times. And it doesn't matter. What you do is you begin to then seek other parts of that are related to healthism, and you build your map of power discourses around that. So then you reconstruct your analysis, and it becomes this very much this sort of multifaceted, unpredictable thing that you don't know how long it's going to be, the analysis, and you don't know how much you're going to find, which is why I ended up writing a thesis of 140,000 words instead of 100 words, and I had to cut 40,000 words out, which was a bit disappointing. But there we go. This is genealogy. It can be really small, or it can really blow out. I chose to focus also on Foucault doesn't give a defined methodology for genealogy. You have to kind of read through the lines, but he talks about going backwards in time. So he talks about the only way we can understand the present is by having what he calls the history of the present analysed. So it becomes really useful. And what I did was focus on going backwards in time. So I started with what's going on now in current contemporary PE, and I work backwards, which is really the opposite of what we do in chronological historical processes. And that's, it basically disbands this linear approach. So here's a link to, and I'll give you a link at the end to the PowerPoint if you haven't found that already. You can read chapter 3 of my PhD. And in chapter 3, I basically explain what genealogy is. And that chapter will give you an understanding of how genealogy might be applied to your own work. I will eventually turn this into a journal article because I think genealogy is so underused. But for now, you can just go to the chapter. It's pretty long. It's about 15,000 words, but it gives you a breakdown of what the genealogical approach is and how I particularly used it. So what are the advantages of genealogy? There's no ethics approval required. There's no time-consuming field work. There's no travel cost for field work. You can do very mindful and very meticulous practice from home. I literally was just the same as this person is on the slide here, just with documents everywhere and pieces of paper everywhere. And that's how it is with sticky post-its and colors and codes and everything. And it's all there for you. You don't have to do anything else. And also it's a very rare methodology. And funnily enough, if you've got a good library, you can find really old documents. So I went right back to 1902 to the first syllabus in physical education, and found some amazing things in that syllabus that nobody had found before. So in terms of the key themes of my book chapter, here's a quick overview. What I found is that in the late 1990s, there was this public health promotion, and that led to body regulation. And what I found was that there was this development of healthism, and it became this rationality of what I found to be third way neoliberalism and governance. And obesity was seen as an economic burden. And how that was dealt with in the policies and the documents that came through was that sport was constructed as a technology, going back to that triangle, remember? And it was constructed from what I believed was a disciplined form of power. So what I found was that we got more and more of a sport notion, a sport discourse coming through in the different documents that I found. It increased in significance, but it also intertwined with and it complemented healthism as a key form of governing, underpinning physical education. And that was all connected with this political notion of third way governance of the body. So if you're aware of any British fitness experts, you'll be familiar with these two on the slide, the green goddess. And so basically what we saw in the late 1990s was this governmental shift, which is still going on now, where we had a personal responsibility for your own health coming through. As far ago as last week, Tony Blair, I put a thing on Twitter, Tony Blair was talking about how everybody needs to take responsibility for their own health. And I was like, oh gosh, here we go again. Tony Blair, New Labour from the 1990s, he's still spouting the everybody has personal responsibility for their own health. So this comes from the advanced liberalism approach, and Foucault talks about this in his work. So interestingly, there's nothing wrong with saying that we should be responsible. I'm not judging it, but it's just a continuous discourse that arises. And what it doesn't take into account is that we have other factors that influence obesity. For example, there is a very, very strong association with obesity and poverty. So we know that in pockets of deprivation, particularly in England, and I'm sure it's the same in Australia, but this research is in England, there are pockets of deprivation, and that is intimately associated with health problems and obesity. So that's never talked about. It's always about the individual citizen actually being able to regulate self and become healthy and more physically active. And my strong belief, and it probably needs to be said out loud, is that because we have this plethora of documents that keep talking about the individual moral obligation for citizens to be healthy, is that we end up really all of these policies fall, you know, they're not very successful. They fall by the wayside because we're not actually dealing with some of these core issues of economic issues that need to be talked about. And what we see is that sport is the solution. Sport has hashtag discipline or / discipline, they become this very important discourse, and we see self-regulation coming through in PE curriculum documents, but we also see it coming through in sport documents, and sport is deemed to be this solution for obesity, as is PE. So there was this governmental shift towards the individual and their need to take personal responsibility. And this is what led to this modern conception of rule that focuses on the conduct of conduct and this new health consciousness, which we call healthism. So in this modern art of governing, what we see is that we don't actually govern a state. We don't actually govern a particular political structure or a territory. There is governance of self, where individuals are governing themselves. And it's what Foucault calls the conduct of conduct. And that arose during the late 1990s in England. And it was definitely influenced by New Labour's third way of thinking when they came to power. And third way is often viewed as a kind of alternative public philosophy to the two other ways of traditional social democracy and neoliberalism. And so what we see arising is this neoliberal concern with, wait for it, competitiveness being prioritized. And we see this entrepreneurial culture that comes through. And that comes through in the sport policy documents and in the physical education documents. So we see individuals are kind of sinking or swimming in this very much this economically framed whirlpool of this neoliberal culture that dominates. And so New Labour decided to achieve their governance aims by securing this sort of attainable level of health at a population level by endowing this entrepreneurial citizen with this regulated freedom and regulated autonomy. So essentially they were told to evaluate and address their unhealthy, their risky lifestyles. Get off the couch, get active, start eating properly. We've heard that same rhetoric for decades now in England, and we hear it a lot in Australia too. So in this sense, we're never enough. And this can be particularly problematic for girls and women as well. So the neoliberal body needs to be slender, needs to be fit, needs to be self-regulating, needs to be wearing Fitbits and, weight watching and making sure that we're all physically active on a regular basis. And as I say, I have nothing against this. It's not a judgment. It's just what arose in the documents that I looked at. So being healthy becomes a moral obligation. And we are actually, we're doing a bad thing if we're not actually engaging in regular physical activity and watching what we eat, etc., etc. So the manifestation of this discursive shift about personal responsibility led to this, as I say, this new health consciousness. So one of the policies that I looked at was this cross-government obesity unit. And I began to sort of deconstruct this a bit more. So certain health behaviors in this particular document, they're really labeled as bad. So as I say, this is not a judgment, because certain things, we know are better for us than others, but there is this very strong moral message that comes through in these documents. So it's under the guise of health promotion strategies, and healthism becomes more and more prominent, and it basically targets individuals' personal responsibility, and their body is seen as a site of regulation, and their body is seen as a site of intervention, rather than, as I mentioned before, overarching social systems. So there's no discussion of poverty and equity and all of the issues that go on in terms of individuals becoming regularly physically active and eating well. So it suggests that the individual always has a choice, and that when it comes to prevent their body becoming diseased. It's your fault. It's a moral imperative that you exercise and that you eat well. So this message is internalized by individuals, and this results in what we call regulated freedom. And there's a need for self-surveillance. And this closely aligns with this development of Foucault refers to the panoptic principles of surveillance and control, where the individual is regulating themselves and this becomes normalized. So what we see is that we have certain health behaviors in relation to exercise and diet as bad. So the Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, wrote the preface for this particular cross-government obesity unit policy in 2008. And I've bolded the parts that I'm particularly interested in here, just to sort of show you how we can decipher what is being actually told us in these documents. There should be no doubt that maintaining a healthy weight must be the responsibility of individuals first. Yeah. Wow. You open up the policy and he's already telling us that it is individuals' actual fault if they are unfit, unhealthy, obese, etc. So it's almost like a hands-off approach. This has nothing to do with the fact that we have 1 in 4 children currently in England who live in poverty. Nothing to do with that at all. Everyone can exercise greater control over their diet and levels of activity, maintaining a healthy weight and lead healthier lives. That's regardless of your ethnicity, regardless of your gender, regardless of your family circumstances, your poverty levels, etc., etc. It's all possible. It's all doable, he says. This is our then Prime Minister, 2008. So what we see is this relationship between physical activity and health, and it becomes very significant. It denotes this shift to in the locus of social control to this individualized, internalized mode of corporeal control. And this is very much connected with, as I say, this third way of thinking, where this individual self-regulates. So here's an extract from the Healthy Weight, Healthy Lives, which is a cross-government strategy for England document. And as you can see, 2004, and it confirms, similar to the previous slide, that individuals have to take responsibility for their weight. It talks about self-regulation. It talks about people needing to exercise greater control. And on page 16, the right-hand image on the slide, there's one reference of several in the document that actually talks about the conflation of PE and sport. So have a look here, high quality PE and sport. So they're just joined together, and they still are in current day. And it becomes very problematic when we actually can't define what PE is, when we can't define what sport is. And then we see ministers doing this again and again. And, you know, whatever political party comes to power in England every 4 years, they all do the same. They all see sport and PE as the same. So we see this plethora of documents where they're just interconnecting. And as a devout physical educationalist who is also a sports coach, I see them as very, very different entities. And I know that many of my colleagues do. So if we move into the National Curriculum Primary Handbook, what we see at the end of the 20th century is that several political authorities, medical authorities, and also professional authorities, they begin to see physical activity as the solution to the obesity epidemic. And what we see is that there's an extension of reach in terms of promoting health within the population, that schools become this site from which obesity might be tackled. And physical education, because it's a body-based subject, is the logical place for obesity to be tackled. That is enormously problematic for us. And it also, and I often have said this on social media, it kind of reconstructs physical education as this technology for public health promotion. And as I've often said, and I've been stoned with tweets, with rotten tomatoes coming my way, you know, why are we saying that we are improving children's fitness through PE. You know, why are we saying that we're working on you know, we can work to improve their speed, we can work to improve their you know, their endurance levels, etc. But how can we say categorically that we improve their speed and endurance through PE when we only do 2-3 lessons a week? And often, you know, there are problems with that. So it raises all sorts of issues in terms of the real possibility of PE and the healthism to which we have subscribed ourselves, because lots of PE teachers believe that they can actually make a difference to children's health in 2 to 3 lessons a week. Well, that's questionable, and I often question it through my research and on social media as well. So what are the outcomes of high quality PE in sport? And there were several of the 10 learning outcomes. So as I've written here, 6 out of 10 focused on healthism and children being taught about the benefits of regular exercise and how their bodies feel when they exercise. So that tells us that PE and sport are basically an important part of a healthy, active lifestyle. Note PE and sport, not just PE. So what we see in the handbook there is, and we've seen in the previous examples that I've given you, is that we've got this recurring and this intersecting sport and discipline and healthism discourses coming through in the forms of evidence. And we see this illustrating the enduring nature of competition within physical education and third way neoliberalism. And we actually saw New Labour's overt pro-sport ideology, which bolstered the perceptions of PE being sport in the school context. And this is enormously problematic. Azarita, one of my favorite scholars, in 2019, she talks about the current practice of schooling neoliberal bodies as framed by a gender-neutral perspective. Bodies at risk, therefore, need fixing, and this is due to their individual poor health choices. So the effect that this has on gender, on the gender neutralizing of neoliberal bodies, is that we have an othering effect, in the sense that girls are socialized into female activities quite often, such as dance and gymnastics. But this shouldn't really kind of undermine the need for girls and boys to have experiences other than health-driven physical activities and competitive sports during their physical education journeys. Why is it that we are leaning into healthism? We are leaning into the importance of competition as opposed to other possibilities within physical education, over and above these informal and these very collaborative possibilities. Competition, as I always say, is learned. It is not a natural phenomenon. We are human beings. We are social beings. We learn competition, and we keep saying it's good for children, but it's only good for children who are successful. Yes, we learn failure, we learn defeat, we build our character, etc., etc. But why is it prioritized more than collaborative things in physical education? And I'm not anti-competition. Again, I'm just raising our awareness of why we do what we do. So research across the 80s and the 90s, it examines the lack of opportunities for girls to engage in traditional male activities, which is big news now, isn't it, with all the lionesses and everything in England. And it says that they need to, you know, have the possibility of engaging in more traditional male activities, rugby, football, etc. But the pendulum seems to have swung to competitive sport, and this still dominates physical education. So other activities, which are seen to be as more feminine, dance, gymnastics, etc., are being marginalized, and for all sorts of reasons. And that might be teacher confidence, teacher competence, teacher training. It could be that certain, pockets within schools. For example, I was reading something recently about a very male-dominated environment in a very working-class area in England, and they were just against doing anything but football. So for them, the whole curriculum was designed around football, but that was because of the behavior problems that were evolved when they were introduced to other types of physical activities. So what we see is that physical education in England, it's very much still a masculinized form of subject, but it's not just masculinized. It's a particularly, as Kirk says, it's a particularly narrow form of masculinity, and that's expressed through the types of sports that we see. And we see that there are competitive sports that emphasize the qualities of strength, power, speed, and also combat. And these become these critical shapers of masculinity. And they're also they fit very well, as I've said, with this neoliberal driving force and what I call sport-infused physical education programs in tandem with these obesity-focused healthism interventions. So really, it's about us raising our awareness as a physical education profession and going back to our curriculum and saying, okay, so why do we have this? Why have we got opportunities for students to involve in collaborative activities as well as competitive? Does competitive still reign supreme in physical education? Where is this notion of healthism? And are we buying into, as a profession, as physical education teachers, are we buying into healthism? And how can we do less? How can we make sure that it's also more gender friendly, also more inclusive, so that children who are less able, less fit, less healthy than others, how can we actually begin to include them in different ways as well? These are all the types of questions that I ask myself regularly in the way that I reflect on everything as a teacher and as a researcher. So what we see is these tensions between the allegedly dominant healthism and discipline. Again, discipline is sport in my analysis of these documents. And we see that across time and between the documents that I analysed, we have discipline emerging through sport, through performance, and through competition discourses. So three things: sport, performance, and competition. But there is this rather complex combination of healthism and discipline that pervade these selected forms of evidence that I used. I used all the physical education syllabuses and a selection of sport documents and health documents. So the physical education student is individualized, normalized, and regulated. There's an exposure of physical education being a corporeal governance, and it highlights how good, disciplined, healthy citizens are shaped through the technology of a school subject. And so coming back to the notion of that power, the governmentality, what we see is that if it does not achieve its desired effects, i.e. getting children to be personally responsible for their physical activity and managing their weight, then what we see is that disciplinary governance re-emerges. So we see sport shooting in as a disciplinary form, modality of power. So physical education, in my research, I can only conclude here, is that it's a technology that's been used to change health-related behavior, to improve not only the body, but to also improve the self by warding off obesity and with those healthism discourses. And it also helps to construct this future citizen, this self-regulating citizen, this competitive citizen for the neoliberal marketplace. So therefore, we have overweight students entering class as the alienated other, and we have the gendered body that is really sort of rendered invisible by these imperatives, these neoliberal imperatives that prioritize this disciplined body at risk. And worryingly for me, this has the effect of alienating many young females in a school subject that's already well known for its enduring gendered regimes. Thank you very much for listening. The next few slides are just my references, so I'll stop there, stop sharing.
Thanks very much, Rachel. That was such an amazing presentation, and you've taken us on a journey starting as the troublemaker that wanted to cultivate consensus. Rather than that, you want to question it, and you certainly did that throughout that presentation.
Thank you.
And the influence of, and you're really bringing to the fore the concept of the neoliberal forces, the healthism focus, and really deliberate examples wherein government documents, it's being highlighted and reinforced. And it's quite we teach our students that whole concept of health is not an individual's responsibility. Yet on the other hand, we've got governments really reinforcing that it is and it has to be. So it's quite a challenging situation to be in, and we loved going through that. You taking us on that journey over a number of years about how things potentially could change, but how much change is my question. Have we actually seen in that time? And finishing with that whole gendered approach, and how, for women in particular, how compromised things are in terms of their supporting vision and confidence in that current environment. So certainly from my perspective, some really powerful and thought-provoking concepts you've put there, and really enjoyed it. And I'd put it across to everyone else. Did you have any questions at this stage for Rachel in terms of what she's been discussing there today? Please put something in the chat if you feel, or feel free to talk up as well. So we've just got, oh, Rachel, you've popped in your...
Oh, yeah, I just put in there the link to the PowerPoint. And also I will upload the recording of this as well to there eventually via YouTube. And in there, you'll also find my book chapter. And what else is there? Yeah, and also just the abstract from today as well.
Yeah, fabulous. So from my perspective and from the RePS organization, we're so proud of you and what you're doing, Rachel, and this is a fabulous opportunity to kick off the series of lectures, and there's more to come.
Yeah.
And you've set such a wonderful standard with these presentations, and the fact that we can share these recordings and these messages can be reverberate throughout the community across the world, I think is fabulous. So thank you very much for today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's the beauty of all of this, is that I may have kicked it off literally using a sporting analogy, but the idea is that we now build on this and we do these. We're having every 2 months, we're having a guest speaker come in, and you don't have to be a researcher either. You can just literally come to us with a problem, and we can all listen to you. You could do 10 minutes, you could do 15 minutes, you can bring a group of you, you can share the space. The idea is that we are raising the profile of teachers as researchers and teachers as critical thinkers. And so, whilst mine is obviously comes from my particular research that I've been doing for many years now, you can literally just be trying to work something out. It could be something that a curriculum design problem that you're doing, and you'd like to offer some thoughts out there, and you want other people to come in with their ideas, or you might say, I don't know how to make this into a research paper. What sort of ideas can I use? Is this doable as a piece of research as well? So we kind of want to see these guest speakers also as a more democratic and community space.
Yeah, fabulous. Rachel, Andy's got a question there just in the chat about changes that might have occurred since the conclusion of your research, particularly in New Zealand, where there's a move to broader conceptions of physical activity, and as it relates to engaging women through reconceptualizing physical culture and what activity is.
That's a really good question, because obviously I always say you have to stop somewhere. So I had to put a timeline on it. In 2016, I was trudging away trying to finish the PhD, and the book chapter evolved from that. And so I had to stop it somewhere. So 2016 was the timeline. So yes, I would say since then, keeping an eye on things. We're 7 years on. And so we do need to be mindful of the fact that there has been a huge debate, particularly in women's sport. Look at the lionesses that have started to emerge from England. We've also had, the women's football, all the Spanish furore that came over about Routledge and so on. All of that, all of those women's feats and achievements seem to be undermined by the patriarchy and gendered issues, unsafe touch, discrimination, etc., etc. So we've had masses of fire, haven't we? Fireballs, really, in the last year, 2 years, and huge changes being made. So I feel very hopeful that the message is getting out. I still feel as though, dare I say this on the recording, there is, from what I feel on social media, there is quite a lot of resistance still. And I wonder why. And I wonder whether that is directly connected to teachers holding on to this knowledge and belief in competitive sports. And it's something that they're really comfortable with, that they've been trained in, that they're really good at themselves, and they don't want to let it go. And so I feel sometimes as though there is this push and pull that goes on, especially on social media, which is all good. I'm all for open debate about it. I also feel as though, and I can't pin the tail on the donkey in terms of geographical things, but there is also a lot of resistance I've found in the US on the level of fitness. And I don't know whether that's state specific or whether it's US specific or whatever, but I run a Facebook page, and there's thousands of people on there, and a lot of them are from the US, and they often talk about the value of fitness testing and so on. And they talk about the state legislation for fitness testing, etc., etc. So that is all tied into healthism, in the sense that states still have for decades tied into this notion of regulating the body in physical education and then moving that forwards by testing them. So there is this panoptic surveillance of the body, and you have to be involved in self-regulation. So you've got the state legislation, panoptical, and then you've got the individual regulating self. So I feel like geographically there are interesting things going on in terms of that. I'm not so familiar with New Zealand. That's a terrible thing to say, but I tend to move in the other direction and go towards Europe because that's my own cultural heritage. And so probably my next task is to actually find out what's going on in New Zealand in terms of physical education curriculum, and see whether there is a shift. I'd like to think there was. What about you, Sam? Do you know anything about New Zealand and what's going on in there?
No, look, I haven't had, like you, I hadn't had the focus in New Zealand.
No.
And I wonder if Andy can add anything more to it. He's got a comment there. It's my move campaign targeting individuals that at least it shifts away from the sport perspective. Yeah. So I'm a little limited as well, so I won't pretend to have much understanding.
But that's definitely something for us to look at, isn't it? As a RePS committee, that would be a really good one, either for the pedagogy research group and or the sport research group.
Yeah, no, for sure. All right, were there any other questions from anyone else there just before we finish up? because it's been a wonderful opportunity to listen to Rachael, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of other discussion that comes from this lecture today, and the lectures that come in the future as well. So if we just keep across the social media, there'll be more promotion of when our next sessions are coming up. But as Rachael mentioned, they're regular and they're diverse, and I think we dig into some really interesting issues. And thanks again, Rachael, for kicking us off this week, and the whole initiative of this RePS group is so fabulous. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for coming, everyone, and thank you for your wonderful chairing, Simon. And that's the other thing we do is we're opening up that possibility too to not people perhaps who don't necessarily lead these types of presentations, but it gives them an opportunity to chair and to lead and to be a bit more of a democracy on that level.
Absolutely. No, it's been great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day, evening, wherever you are.
No worries. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.